And we're back, and you're learning about the Constitution line by line.
So are we.
So are we. And now we are out of the original Constitution into what is known as the Bill of Rights. Now, Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments. Why are they called that?
To be honest, I don't know.
Goes back to the English antecedent.
That's what I assume.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's a listing of rights. Why they call it a bill? I'll leave that
It's just
to you.
antique language.
Okay. Now, really, since you brought this up, I'm just going to say it.
Spin it.
The 27th Amendment was part of the original Bill of Rights.
Yeah, but it didn't make the cut.
It didn't make the cut then, but it made the cut 203 years later. So I would challenge what you said by saying the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments. It's the first 10 amendments and the 27th Amendment. Okay?
All right, interesting.
But
now
I just have to tweak you a little bit there.
We have arrived at one of the most...
Political science, history.
Yes, Paul Fabrizio, Don Frazier. And we have arrived at one of the most tweakable of the amendments.
Oh, Don.
Always a hot one.
Do we have to talk about this one?
We do have to talk about this one.
Okay.
This is the Second Amendment. This is the one about the right to arm bears. Bear arms.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, what's our line?
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
And that's it.
That's it. And that's it.
And that's it. And what's interesting is here's homework for our listeners and our viewers. Go
But no
get them.
test.
Yeah, well, living in America is the test. It's a
that's
very
true.
long, drawn-out oral exam, as it turns out. But what you need to do is get a electronic version of the Constitution, do a keyword search, see how many times the word militia comes up in the original document, because it's in there a bunch.
Mm-hmm. It is.
I think it's interesting that this particular amendment starts out that a well-regulated militia is vital to
The security of a free state. And it's important to know that this is the only amendment to the Constitution that gives a reason for the amendment.
Yeah.
All the others just say Congress shall not. This one says, no, we need to explain.
Yeah. In order
What's
to
going
have a free state, then we need to have a well-regulated militia that's well-armed.
Okay. So, by the way, did it say well-armed or just say armed?
Well, it just says armed.
Okay. We need to be careful since we're playing with this thing.
Correct.
So, what is a militia back in the framers' day? What do they mean by that?
Back in the framers' day, everybody was obligated to perform militia duty. So this is freeborn males aged 17 to 40 usually. So that's your time frame. That's your military-aged males.
Okay. Let's make sure. So males, freeborn,
Yes. So slaves are not obligated to serve in the militia.
and after age 40 you don't have to?
Yeah, you're kind of done. If you're still alive at age 40, that's a miracle.
Okay, and under age 40?
You don't.
I mean, under age 18?
17, yeah, 17. So
Okay.
16-year-olds don't have to serve. 41-year-olds do not have to serve.
Okay.
So that's usually the militia age. And the idea was that you would have a well-regulated militia in every state.
Did they?
No,
Okay.
because they became drinking clubs. And they became social clubs, and they would go boating on the day of the weekend they were supposed to be well regulated. You know, you're supposed to go and learn how to drill and learn how to do close order drill, do tactical advance, tactical retreat, do all the different maneuvers that you would have to do on a battlefield,
And then practice firing your
and
weapon.
then practice firing your weapons that you have not been restricted from owning.
Right.
So you should, you'd go to the range and make sure that you could, hit something at 50 meters. And, if you were a mounted militia, you'd go riding along and make sure you could cut a pumpkin in half with your saber and all that sort of stuff. But no, that's a lot of work. Ebediah, where's your gun? Oh, I forgot it back in the barn. I was shooting rats with salt and I forgot my gun. And so, well, you can't drill today. Well, I need to have credit for drilling because I've got to bring in the crop next weekend. and it just deteriorates. So maintaining military discipline among part-time soldiers
was very difficult.
was very, yeah, I'm trying to stress that, very, very difficult. And the idea that militia would be able to stand up in a fight, we've already talked about, 2 good volleys, then you can run. So even the militia understood that there's not a lot expected of us.
So, in your mind, what was the point of this amendment? Was it an encouragement saying, "Hey, we all should have a state militia"?
Yes, I think that this was.
And by the way, if you do, you get a gun.
I think this was an encouragement in the context of its day to have every citizen a soldier.
Okay.
Very similar to what you might encounter today in, say, Switzerland or Israel.
Okay.
And
but at least those are well regulated.
They're well regulated.
Did this actually work?
Did the well-regulated militia
actually occur after they had this amendment?
Well, we had variations of it.
Okay.
So we actually had a militia that was called out especially against Indians.
Okay.
So Native Americans, the settlers are in an uproar, call out the militia, and usually the Indians clock the militia. Just clocked them. I mean,
wow.
Everybody thinks about the biggest defeat of U.S. armed forces at the hands of the indigenous peoples of this continent being Custer's last stand.
Yeah.
Oh, no. It's Hamer's defeat up in Ohio.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah, no one's ever heard of it. They killed about 800 militiamen.
Oh, my.
Yeah, they just slaughtered them because the militia broke ranks and ran, and the Indians just ran them down and killed them as they ran. And they just left a string of dead guys all the way back to the Pennsylvania border, and so down to the Ohio River. It was a huge, huge disaster. So the militia did not work very well. It was never well regulated and did not work very well. Now then, during the War of 1812, we've already talked about the New York militia voting to stay out of Canada, so that didn't work too well.
This is all in lieu of a standing army.
Correct, because it's cheap.
Yeah.
It's cheap, and it gives everybody skin in the game. Mm-hmm. There was a fiasco at Bladensburg, Maryland, in which the militia dropped their guns and ran, and it was only a small battalion of U.S. Marines that were able to cover the retreat, and it was called the Bladensburg Races, and caused Dolly Madison to take all the art off the walls at the White House.
We're out of here.
Yeah, thanks for stopping the British, guys. We got to pack everything up and go. And so the militia didn't quite work out. Now then, where people get more interested in a well-regulated militia is in the Deep South about 1856.
Oh,
and then they start
timing.
forming militias that are well-regulated.
Wow.
And that said, they're doing this in places like Illinois. They're doing it in places like New York. There was paramilitary groups called Wide Awakes that were wide awake to everything that was going on in the country. And they said, hey, we are well-regulated militias, and we should be able to have state-of-the-art firearms.
Did at the time of the Constitution being written, did people have the right to own a gun if they were not in the militia?
No, not necessarily. One of the tactics that the British had used against anybody that they found troubling was to disarm them.
Okay.
So the Scots, after the risings in 1715, 1745, they disarmed them. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times you had Scottish clansmen fighting British troops, sword and buckler versus bayonet, because can't anybody keep me from pounding a plowshare into a sword down at the blacksmith, but they can certainly keep me from having a Brown Bess and 40 rounds of ammunition in a box. The Irish are all disarmed. You can't have weapons in Ireland. That's when they throw their rebellions. That's when you get lines like the pikes must be together at the rising of the moon, because the best they could do is stick a knife on the end of a long pole. So, disarming your population, disarming your subjects was a common tactic. Disarming your citizens is what we're talking about here.
Right.
And they're saying, no, we got to have these citizens to have skin in the fight. We need them to rise up to defend the country. They've got to have a firearm to do it with.
But only certain citizens.
Only the militia.
Only the militia.
That's the way I read it. The well-regulated militia, even at that.
Yeah. So it's not an unlimited right.
I would,
by your historical perspective.
From my historical perspective and putting it back into the context of when these words were penned, everybody that wants to have an AK-47 or an AR-15 should be obligated to enroll in a militia organization that's well regulated by whatever state or federal entity and do a drill every month that they know how to be a responsible firearm user.
Was this also...
Now, that's setting aside things like shotguns, deer rifles and pistols.
Was this also an effort to keep guns out of the hands of slaves?
Probably so. And that's where you see a role in the militia as well in the South, is you had the slave patrollers.
Okay.
And these were guys that, would make sure that there weren't any loiterers or people off their plantation that weren't supposed to be. And that's also kind of part of this as well. Why you would have to have a well-regulated militia, because there may be a slave insurrection that needs to be suppressed.
And we don't want our slaves to have weapons either.
Well, correct. I mean, the thought of them being part of a well-regulated militia was inconceivable.
Right.
But, I mean, the first time the militia was really called out against other citizens is probably the Whiskey Rebellion, in which Pennsylvania militia.
What year was that?
1790, somewhere in there.
Okay.
And I could look it up, but Google has made us all soft-headed. But point is, Washington takes command in the field as president and leads a column of largely militia to go suppress a domestic insurrection in western Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And so these guys all needed to show up with their rations, with their gun, and knowing how to use it.
Okay. And the standing army at that time
was minuscule.
I mean, we recently celebrated the 200-and-something anniversary of the founding of the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
But they were basically a coastal defense, I would guess.
Well, they were actually shipboard.
Shipboard.
Yeah.
Okay. But what you described is the context in which the amendment was written.
Correct.
It's fascinating to me to hear that and then look at where the amendment is today.
Well, because everybody leaves that first part off.
Right.
The right to bear arms shall not be infringed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But that's a dependent clause.
Yeah, exactly.
To a well-regulated militia. So you're talking about a leading advocate for a well-regulated militia. I think that would be awesome. Because one of the biggest dangers to any sort of armed force is young men with guns that don't know how to use them. Mm-hmm. I asked my Iraq war vets, when were you the most scared? So I was the most scared when I was at the end of a column and understood that I was surrounded by people with guns, and I didn't know if they knew how to use them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now this is an Army, trained
right.
soldier, and he's looking
with discipline, etc.
Yeah,
they were well regulated.
Looking at 19 and 20-year-old guys from all over the country, and you just didn't know how well trained they were or how smart they were, and things like that. And a bullet is forever, oftentimes. Yeah. And so the well-regulated militia, I think, is the part that people just run right past. I mean, if I was anti-guns as a politician, I would quit trying to ban guns. Mm-hmm. I'd say, no, gun ownership comes with obligation. And here's your obligations. Mm-hmm. You can own whatever guns you want, but here's your obligation. And if you quit showing up to these meetings, then you can't own that style of firearm. Banning assault weapons didn't work the first time. Mm-hmm. And then when the assault ban, faded, everybody bought assault weapons. So it had the net effect of putting more assault weapons into the population, in my opinion. So maybe they should say, no, we don't want to ban assault weapons. In fact, we want to celebrate assault weapons and the productive and well-regulated use of same.
You're one of the few people who focuses on the first part of the amendment.
Which strikes me as odd because it's the lead part.
Yeah. And it stands out because, as I said, it's the only amendment that has that clause there.
Yeah.
The reason for the amendment.
Here's why we got to do this, guys. We know this looks a little hinky, and it may lead to some bad outcomes, but we're going to try to mitigate it. We got to keep a free country, and we have to rely on you guys to keep it free. So this is very clearly saying that owning these weapons is also a way of keeping the nation free.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it presupposes that the threat may be an external threat.
Right. Not an internal threat.
Not an internal threat. But then you're having everybody swearing oaths to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. So the theory is that we all agree on the Constitution. We're not going to try to overthrow the Constitution. We're going to try to keep whatever bad's happening from coming over.
So your argument, in essence, is that we have ignored the first part of this amendment focus on the second one.
Yeah.
And we've ignored it to our peril.
Yeah, I think that we should have an entirely different
perspective on
this and an entirely different view towards firearms in this country.
Okay. Well, let me then jump in
and
here.
And I own several of these classes of firearms, understand.
Let me jump in here with not a different perspective, but a legal perspective of where we are related to this amendment. Throughout most of history, anything dealing with the Second Amendment didn't make it up to the Supreme Court. And in fact, there's very little case law about the Second Amendment, because when you talk about ownership of weapons, believe it or not, you're really talking about the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, correct.
And the 10th Amendment says powers not given to the national government are given to the states. So the states is where regulation of guns
has landed.
And however you define that term, it's landed. And so
and it was the states that kind of didn't well regulate their militias.
Right. And so that's why today you have strict regulations in certain localities.
Correct.
And
like Chicago, for instance, where there's very little gun violence as a result.
And very, very little regulation in other places.
Correct.
Vermont, Texas, places
Correct.
like that. But I have to add, there has been a Supreme Court case called the Heller case. And the Heller case came out.
Oh, Heller, yes.
Yeah, came out, I believe, 2008. I'm not positive about the date. But the Heller case, for the first time, established the idea that the Second Amendment guarantees to an individual the right to have a weapon. That had never been established beforehand.
Oh, wow. So that's the one that opened the gates.
And the antecedent to that really came from where we live here in West Texas, where there was a case, and it was in the federal court system here. It didn't go to the Supreme Court, but a judge here was the first one, and this was, I believe, in the late 90s, where a judge here for the first time ruled that we have an individual right to own a gun per the Second Amendment. Before that, everything dealt with the 10th Amendment. This judge said, no, it's found in the Second Amendment. And then that eventually led to the Heller case before the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, yes, there is an individual right to own a gun. And then in relation to, the current gun debate, the justices on the court, and it was written by Antonin Scalia, the great conservative, the originalist, he said that it is not an unlimited right, that just like every other right, it is not absolute. There are limits. The government can put regulations around gun ownership.
Yeah, like maybe a well-regulated militia.
See, and you keep going back, then that's a really interesting point, because that's not what you hear too much other than just lip service.
Yeah.
And the lip service is a well-regulated militia. Militia is everybody, so therefore everybody owns the right to a gun.
Well, what happened with the militia is it essentially got turned into the National Guard.
Right.
And so this doesn't say you have to join the National Guard. It says you have to join a well-regulated militia, and to do that, your tool is your weapon. Now, there's some states that have a state guard, like Texas has a state guard.
Yeah.
So, I think that some sort of obligation to prove that you're a responsible gun owner is not out of round.
Is not out of round per the Constitution.
Per the Constitution, my read on it.
Yeah. Based on what the Constitution is. Now, at the same time, here in Texas, the Texas Constitution guarantees people the right to own a gun.
Sure.
And I don't think it says anything about a well-regulated state militia.
This is the supreme law of the land.
This is the supreme law of the land. So it says we can have one, but it allows for regulations, and that would be done at the state level. Then you look to the state constitution, what does that say? So one of the things that we have to deal with is that you can have all sorts of restrictions on your guns in certain places and not in others. And that's perfectly allowable under the framework provided by the Constitution.
But see, if you had a well-regulated militia,
So you go back to, and I think that's a fascinating point.
then the militia of Chicago could patrol their streets.
Yeah. It's a whole different way to look at things if they're well regulated.
If they're well-regulated, well-trained militia, and well-regulated.
And to the framers, or at the time, the militia was limited to men 18 to 40.
17 to 40.
Okay, and that would be it.
Yeah.
Today, who could we have in the militia?
No,
Anybody.
men, women, white, black, yellow, red,
Okay.
robots,
Yeah.
eventually.
Who will be complaining about their
Who will be complaining and be well within their rights, perhaps.
Maybe. We'll get to that later.
All right, so that's Second Amendment.
Yeah.
And we haven't even unpacked all the sort of nuance and stuff because we're just dealing with the text.
Yeah.
And feel free to comment on YouTube and SoundCloud your displeasure with my particular take, understanding that I have an SKS in a gun safe and, you know, a little 9mm that's semi-automatic, which is really a terrible gun. But it's kind of like stock on it. It's my pig gun for shooting wild hogs.
Okay.
But those might, according to this read, carry with them an obligation.
Yeah. You have an interesting take on this, and I really appreciate that. I think it's more of a historical reading of this that it's based on than what we hear about today.
Than the lawyering that has gone on since.
Well, to me, it's not just lawyering. This is a political issue.
Yes.
And all the various sides are trying to make political points, and they just cling on to the Constitution when it serves their purposes.
Who
and
doesn't cherry pick?
Yeah, and they pick the parts that work for them, and then they move on. And they claim, well, that's what the Second Amendment says.
Well, the second part of the Second Amendment,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
But the first part, you kind of
Is
read right
another
past.
thing, yeah. All right.
So that's our line.
That's our line.
We'll get off
what
to
a
the-
line.
We'll go to the Third Amendment next time.